Today on the show, we're going to be talking to Chris Fenton, who is largely responsible for getting a ton of films into China. In fact, the way that Hollywood has been dealing with China, trying to get movies to pass the censorship board, all this kind of stuff, Chris had a lot to do with this. He produced or supervised 22 films, grossing $2 billion in the box office worldwide, and packaged 63 other films. And he is the author of a book called Feeding the Dragon. He now talks to Congress and people in power to try to get them to change their tactic or the way that we deal with China in the future. So it was an honor to have him on, and I hope you guys enjoy our chat. Well, I do want to start off by saying thank you for making my life more interesting in China, because without your kind of push to get a lot of these movies into theaters in China, I wouldn't have bonded, with a lot of my Chinese friends / wife, now girlfriend at the time, taking her to go see movies on dates and stuff. I feel like we wouldn't have had the same romantic bond over like Mao's Red China, the sixth time in a row. So it was really, really good that we had some interesting films to be able to watch.
Well, I'm happy you didn't have to watch Founding of the Republic Part 8.
Yes. So I actually wanted to ask you a couple things just to get started. Like, you were in and out of China, and you are largely responsible for making the Chinese audiences see American films. And I wanted to ask you at the time, so we're talking like 2000, were you there 2006-ish in the beginning?
Yeah, so I never actually lived full time in China. I was sort of the eyes and ears and the connector for a company based in Beijing to the outside world to create business ventures, particularly in the cultural and commercial space. So I was back and forth, 30, 40 something times. And that was circa, the first visit was in the very early 2000s. And then that took me all the way through to my final visit, which was just prior to COVID. But the main thrust of what I focused on in the book, because I wanted it timeless and really capture sort of the peak of cultural and commercial exchange between the two countries. And maybe it will peak again, I don't know, but obviously it's way down from what it used to be. But that really focused on the years circa 2000 to 2014. And then really it started to get going in a huge way post the Summer Olympics in 2008. Okay,
good. So we have a timeline now. So when you were in and out of China trying to get these movies into market, I mean, I think a lot of people know the current talking point is like, what did Hollywood have to do to censor movies to get them into the Chinese market? And you and I both know, to deal with, specifically the Chinese government, the rigmarole that you have to go through to make some of those things happen. But can you give me some specific examples of like what an audience could go out there and watch in a movie and be like, yeah, that was in there for the Chinese market?
Right. Well, if you look at it from the Western perspective, the Hollywood perspective, there's an interesting, and you probably saw this with various other industries and companies that you came across living there, but there was always like this metamorphosis that occurred with people entering the country for that market, right? And it was like, oh, headquarters is in the US or Europe. We'll open up a division in Japan to service China, or we'll open up a place in Hong Kong. And then it sort of morphed into, oh, we'll put some expats that know nothing about China, but we got to put them out to pasture in China. No one wants to live in Beijing, so we'll put them in Shanghai. And then eventually they put them in Beijing. And then eventually they found out like expats that know nothing about China can't get anything done in China other than just the easiest stuff. So then they started to try to figure out, how do you get like real China experts to figure it out? But the bottom line is, through all of that were so many mistakes that were made in regards to the China market overall. I mean, 1997 was obviously the biggest, sort of boo-boo in regards to how Hollywood was reacting to China and looking at it. And that was really in terms of three different movies, Kundun, Red Corner, and 7 Years in Tibet, that were made by Hollywood that weren't even made for the market itself, but were made for the rest of the world. And China heard about them and essentially penalized the companies, one of them which was Disney, for even making the movie, regardless of whether
Right.
it's supposed to go into China, making a movie about subject matter that they did not want made into global content. And
Hmm.
that was really the first step in dog crap that occurred for Hollywood when it came to China. And there was a lot of obviously kowtowing and pandering to try to get relationships back on course, in particular with Disney and the other studios that were doing it. And it wasn't just about movies. Like at the time, the movie business in China was pretty much, like pachinko parlors or something in a city that they put up speakers for on Saturday nights, that kind of a thing. So it wasn't about the market of movies there. It was more about the market of the IP created by these companies and what that consumer product and theme park and all the other stuff that was going to occur in that massive market downstream was going to be someday. So all these studios had to be really careful about it. So you go from 1997 into the 2000s, and suddenly the movie market started to mean a little bit. So the content wasn't just about, oh my God, we can't make anything about Tiananmen Square or Tibet or Hong Kong or human rights or Xinjiang or whatever it is, right? We actually have to start making movies that are slightly relevant to China, right? And that's where sort of not only was there proactive censorship, but there might have been a start of thinking, oh, well, would this movie appeal to both the US and China? Because if we can get the US and China to like this movie, then the rest of the world will fall into place, right? Those are the two hardest circles of the Venn diagram to get to coincide. And once they coincide, everybody else sort of falls into place, right?
Sure.
So that's when calculus started. And there were a lot of mistakes done during that time frame. But 2008 was pivotal, right? 2008 was the Summer Olympics, and everything stopped for like 2 years prior to that coming of age party that China was throwing. So there wasn't a lot of emphasis put on anything other than the Olympics and the brands involved with the Olympics and the products involved with those Olympics. And even the movie business was sort of put on hiatus for a second. But once those Olympics were done, all the Chinese officials wiped their brow and said, thank God that worked, right? And then they started to look at their 5, 10, 25, 50, 100-year plans. And one of the plans they had was to build a film industry that rivaled the US and eventually would be the biggest film business in the world. And that's when Hollywood said, oh my gosh, now it's not just about teeing up our companies to gain access to that market for a variety of different reasons. But now it's about tailoring movies so we can actually make revenue directly from that market, from the people sitting in theaters.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. I remember specifically from the book, and I thought this is a great parallel to the whole thing, to be able to get media into China, to get the government to approve something is a bit of a tit and tat. It's like a back and forth, right? And when you guys were working on getting Marvel stuff into the country, it was funny that, I could just remember things like this actually happening when I was there, but going to the silk market and seeing all the illegal DVDs, seeing all these pirated movies and stuff, and seeing that the Marvel stuff had been removed, seeing that this, they had gone out there and done due diligence and made a huge effort to make sure that they were not stepping on your toes, was the kind of the give and take, right? And it showed, and it just reminded me of how China can really just do something immediately if they really want to, make grand movements and grand efforts. And also a really great, really funny thing in the book, actually, that reminded me of this was when you had to get the security detail for Robert Downey Jr. And you guys basically went out into the countryside and gathered, 6-foot plus farmers to be these like cheap Taobao suit wearing security guards that had no idea what they're doing. First time in the city, bright eyed lights everywhere. It shows you that you have to also use very non-traditional means of making something happen within China as well, when the Chinese government also decides that they're not going to help in that scenario, right? And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in the book that the NBA always got priority. They would have security detail. They would have policemen. They would have, PLA potentially, People's Liberation Army. But for the movie industry, you guys really had to build those steps. You guys had to make that stuff happen. What was this huge diplomacy difference between the movie industry and NBA?
Wow, there's a lot. So there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, number one is that farmer episode, and first of all, it's just one example of the
Sure.
insanity that we had to deal with, right?
Right.
And in almost everything in China, you just got to be a jack of all trades and just roll with it and duct tape over stuff and just make it work, right? Because a lot of the stuff had no templates ahead of time, and you just, you couldn't just use a case study from before and just repeat it because you were doing stuff for the first time. So doing a large scale premiere like we did for Iron Man 3 inside the Forbidden City was just, no one had seen that before, and it was sort of crazy to pull off. And then on top of it, the ability to do it the right way in sort of a Western style was even harder because that just didn't translate to the China side. So you look at the farmers, those farmers were literally a 45, I mean, without traffic, a 45-minute drive outside of the city. Yet it was literally like as if they were living in the Sichuan province out in the hinterlands, right? Like
Might as well, yeah.
difference between them and people in the central business district was unbelievable. The other thing too is that you talked about getting movies into the country, right? Like there's a lesson I teach a lot in the book in between all the fun stories, and it's literally that you have to sell to two entities there. One is you got to sell to the Chinese government, and number two is you got to sell to the Chinese public, the reason why they should take money out of their wallet and give it to the film, right? So one of the things that would occur, and you mentioned earlier that like I had to figure out how to get this stuff into China. Well, it wasn't me. I mean, if you look at me, I don't look like a guy that would know the nuance of China, right? Like
Sure.
I know the outer side of the onion peel, but essentially we had a big infrastructure that would talk to the Chinese government and the Ministry of Propaganda. And at the time, there was the State Administration of Radio, Film, and Television, and then the Film Bureau and China Film Group. And they would sort of run by the ideas of what these movies were. And then they would get a general sense of how they were reacting, where their eyebrows went up, et cetera. And then they would relate it to me. And then my job was really to find out, okay, they want hardcore propaganda out of this movie for their audience and the rest of the world. How do I take what they want and try to figure out like how to fit it into what the bastion of freedom of creativity, Hollywood, is going to allow? And that was the real difficult challenge that we had. And I talked through that process quite a bit in the stories of the book and how difficult it actually was, because you really had to convince filmmakers and people that were just trying to make a great movie and had a vision, how to implement the brand integration of China into the film. And then once you got that figured out, then the government was like, okay, we'll back this movie. We'll let you get it in. But then the key also was to make sure those stories, those themes, those plots, those characters, the dialogue, all that stuff when translated would be as relevant as possible to the Chinese audience. Because remember, this is stuff that's different than the founding republic and all the other stuff that they've been seeing over the years. You need to make sure it has universal themes and things that are relevant to that market. And that's why now that they're making world-class movies, those movies are making $1 billion in their own market, because not only are they making world-class Hollywood style movies, because we taught them how to do that, but they're making them in a way that are super relevant to their people, right? So and then back to let me go back to your question, which was, the difference between the NBA and Hollywood in circa 2013, right? At that time, leverage is everything when it comes to the Chinese government. And they know when they have leverage. And they were building movie screens at a torrid pace then, right? And Hollywood was aware that with the downsizing of the home entertainment market and all the other stuff that was happening to the Hollywood ecosystem that was crushing revenues, right? That China was the great white hope, right? So Chinese government knew that we needed them more than they needed us at that time. So when we would come in with, say, Robert Downey Jr. or, a big movie like that, they knew that, hey, you guys figure it out. You need us, and, you just get it done. Whereas the NBA was interesting because David Stern and Michael Jordan and that whole crew started to work what was already a nice template that missionaries and everybody else brought into that country, which was the game of basketball, a game of basketball that was really relevant to the people there. You could play it on a blacktop. in the middle of a city or out in the field with a hoop, whatever it was. You don't need to be Yao Ming size. You can be, a point guard, whatever it is. And it was very much like a ping pong, right? And there was a very relevant aspect to the game of basketball. And then on top of it, the Western brand of the NBA and its biggest star, Michael Jordan, seeded itself in there in 1990, right after Tiananmen Square. I mean, they were there when the rest of the world was wondering, do we still want to do business with this country, right? Because June 4, 1989 was a real pivotal moment where we could have either turned away or turned towards them, right? And the NBA never wavered. They went straight that way, right? And they've been there for a long time. And at that point, when we were trying to figure out, well, how are we going to secure Robert Downey Jr. versus our other client at the time, Kobe Bryant, when he would come to town, it was like they rolled out the red carpet. They had the PLA, the PAP, they had, everybody there taking care of this guy. Whereas Robert Downey Jr. shows up, and even the day after the premiere, the guy left his hotel and just walked around Tiananmen Square with a hoodie on, like no one even knew he was there. So that was the difference. Like, in one case, the China needed the NBA. In the other case, Hollywood needed China.
Right. Okay. That's great. I do want to ask you though, when you look at diplomacy through athletics, and now we're talking about diplomacy through media, what extent do you think American values are instilled in those things? Like, to what extent is an NBA player in China, or not an NBA player, an NBA fan, I should say, in China, walking around constantly thinking, this is an American element. I like this sport, so therefore I'm more friendly. I have more friendly feelings towards the U.S. and its people. Same with Hollywood. I went to go watch Transformers. I went to go watch Iron Man. To what extent is this person walking away from that, and then maybe not so much being conscious about the brainwashing type stuff that they might have learned in the education system, that the U.S. is the enemy, that, the government constantly puts out xenophobic propaganda on, CCTV they're consuming. How conscious do you think people are? How much do you think seeps in from those elements?
Well, there's two sides of that story. One is the making of the game or making of the content itself, and then the other side is the digestion of the content or the competition, right? So in the making of it, I can tell you that whether we were putting on 3-on-3 tournaments with big NBA stars judging them, or doing huge things with Nike or the NBA China or with the NBA, like the process of putting those events and those productions together with US and China side by side working on those crews was an incredible person-to-person act of diplomacy, this bridging the gap of different cultures. And it was really a magical process, right? The same thing with making movies, whether it was Looper, Iron Man 3, you have US crews mixing with Chinese crews, you have US stars mixing with Chinese stars. Like, that camaraderie created around the cooperation of making huge budget, big movies for the globe was a really powerful bridging force. Okay. Now, with the digestion of both, right? The digestion of watching those competitions for the NBA and wanting to know who those players are and what they do and what they wear and what they listen to and what makes them tick. That was a very powerful sort of aspirational quality of what the NBA brought to the consumer in China, that in a very sort of subliminal way spread the power of the soft power of diplomacy and democracy into the ether, right? Like watching what LeBron James does on short clips after you saw the movie. Oh, he's in LA doing this. He's driving his, Bentley. He's hanging out, at whatever restaurant, to checking out what, the other players are doing, what the coaches are doing, all that kind of stuff, because of that curiosity factor, on top of just watching the games on television in these big arenas with all the different brands around them and all the different people of having a free democratic style living. Aspirationally was great, and soft power, effusion into that market was really strong. And it was just subliminal, and it obviously was involuntary for the most part. It just happened, right? With movies, the same thing. I would argue like neutral romantic comedies that would get in, or, action movies with zero political statements or messaging in them, if there are those in Hollywood. Obviously, a lot of people would criticize they're all filled with that stuff, but that stuff just spread the soft power of democracy throughout the people. You saw the freedoms of the people in the movies and what they were doing, what they were able to say in certain cases that wasn't censored, and how they lived, and what they were carrying as handbags. And, it obviously created all kinds of different good mixture in regards to the way people growing up in a communist country were allowed to digest how people in the West lived, right? Then when it comes to the actual, purposeful push of propaganda from the West, which Hollywood has been very good at with the rest of the world. I mean, if you look in the 1950s, or, when we were competing with the Soviet Union to win over Africa, I mean, there was obviously jazz musicians going over there, and stars and actors. And we were trying to say, look, here's big celebrities and content you like, and they live in democracy. And then Soviet Union was doing the opposite for them. Look at our Red Penguins, the best hockey team in the world, or whatever it was, right? Like, we were competing through cultural awareness of what democracy was versus communism. And a lot of times we created soft power propaganda, right? Like you'd argue Wind of Change, right? The Scorpion song was actually purposely put in, and written for the, Soviet Union market to digest. And eventually it helped them want democracy, whether that's a conspiracy or not, it's a great story, right? But like Top Gun, let's face it, the original Top Gun, anybody around the world watching it is going, oh my God, US is a superpower, an amazing military. I want to be Iceman. I want to be Tom Cruise, whatever it was, right?
Still feel like that when I see it.
Yeah, it's an amazing flick. And now that still works for most of the country, most of the world, although they don't really want it in their faces much anymore. But when it comes to China, China doesn't want it at all, right? Like that purposeful soft power push, they're going to censor all day long, right? And for the most part, they probably won't even let the movies in, right? In the case of Top Gun, we've heard, and I'm still curious to see if it actually does get into China, which is going to be really interesting. And I don't know if it will. We'll see. There's Chinese partners in that movie, so we'll see what happens. But they did force Paramount and the filmmakers to take the Taiwanese flag off of Tom Cruise's jacket. And that's not because they're afraid of what their own Chinese people are going to see inside the PRC. They want everybody around the world not to recognize Taiwan as a separate sovereign state, right? So they're telling Paramount, no one in the world can see that flag, right? And don't worry about our market. We'll figure out if we want your movie in or not. But Paramount is like the first thing they're thinking of is like, well, wait, we don't want to kill the golden goose with this one movie that screws up all our other movies, regardless of whether this movie gets in. They're thinking about the big enchilada of what their business is in China. So they scrubbed that flag, and now we'll see if it even gets into China. But at least for the Chinese Communist Party, they're going, hey, we just scrubbed another reference to Taiwan being a sovereign state. So that's a great thing for us, right?
Yeah,
not for Hollywood.
I don't want to insert too much personal opinion, but I'm here to talk to you, obviously. But one thing I was very conflicted about was I saw a lot of myself in your story, in that when I was in China, I'm rooting for China. In fact, when I'm reading your book, I'm still rooting for China. I'm rooting for you to get past the censor board. I'm rooting for your films to get, Chinese release, because it teleports me back to a time where I had a ton of hope for the country. Even if you have to put up with absolute ridiculous things and measures from the government and standards and rules and practices, you still put up with it because you give it the excuse that, hey, China's developing, number one, and number two, this is so worth putting up with because it's the two biggest countries in the world, but two biggest superpowers in the world, being able to come together on something. And the reason I was quite conflicted, like towards the end, is that I know for a fact that state media and, large friend circles that I have in China would take the Chinese government's kind of censorship of some of these films and the Chinese government's heavy-handedness in some of these films and removing certain elements from these films. And instead of hiding it, actually putting it to the forefront and saying this was a huge win for our China because we are so powerful now that we can have manipulation and effect over American media. Look at how far we've come. And I've seen that goodwill and all the stuff that I was fighting for kind of get lost in the message of this government's overt message. And that they want to say, look at how weak America has become and look at how powerful China is to have such an influence over this kind of media. And it's almost like the goodwill ambassadors and people that were really fighting for that bridge are getting pushed to the wayside. Whereas like the forefront xenophobic message of China good, the rest of the world bad is really winning out, at least in public media. Do you agree with that, and how do you feel about that?
Well, I feel for your audience because it's almost like you and I have the same brain right now in regards to this topic, right?
Sure.
You know, when Simon Schuster, you know, came to me and said, "Hey, write this book," you know, one of the things I said was, I'm trying to figure out how to make it timeless, right? Like, because to make it timely, you're going to just be chasing stories every day, and it's going to be like out of, you know, by the time it's printed, it's going to seem out of date. So what I wanted to do was transport me mentally back in time to the years 2000 to 2014 and the way I was thinking, which was exactly the way that you were thinking. My engine was spreading soft power and aspirational quality of democracy inside a communist country to try to win them over someday. I mean, I guess non-Americans would feel like that's very imperialistic or something.
Sure.
You know, but I am American. I can't be ashamed that I grew up here and I'm patriotic. Sure. Okay. Number two is, you know, what the entertainment business was, this cultural and commercial exchange. You know, China wasn't much of a market when I started. In fact, it was almost a zero. So every dollar that I was able to be a cog in the wheel of the process of pulling out of China and bringing it to the US was an extra dollar of GDP, right? Mm-hmm. And then on top of it, every dollar translated to more jobs, right? So I felt like spreading democracy around the world, you know, bringing in, you know, money from a market that didn't exist before and growing GDP and building jobs. Like that was the engine that was my purpose, my mission, right? Like, because there's a lot easier ways to make money out there, right? Like that was a chaotic 20 years, but I felt like there was a bigger mission and purpose. And I think like you, and I might be wrong, but just in listening to your interviews and some of your, you know, and obviously seeing your movies over the years, you obviously had something similar like that. That was your engine, right? And on top of it, I have kids. I have 2 kids in high school or freshmen in high school, and I don't want them growing up in a world that was, you know, with a frozen relationship between 2 superpowers where every day we have to wonder if there's going to be a mushroom cloud, right? Like, I don't want that, right? So we don't want Cold War or war with the superpower. But at a point, I got literally punched in the nose, and not literally, but like it was like a punch in the nose moment that I woke up and I was like, oh my God, like everything I was a part of. And by the way, I was just a cog in the wheel. Like this is
I understand.
It's Fenton being more important than anything.
Of course.
I was a cog in the wheel of doing something that was detrimental to the long-term health of the United States of America, and quite frankly, all of our Western allies too. And what you're saying about this leverage we gave to China in the process, right? Not only did we do 2 things, we did 2 terrible things long-term. One is they said, you can sell fish in our market, but you got to teach us how to fish to do it. Okay. Well, guess what? In Hollywood, we taught them how to fish to get access to that market to sell them fish. And now they catch fish better than we do. And we're thrown out and they have their own market. And that's the end of the story. And that's the canary in the coal mine for every other industry and company it's going to happen to. Okay. That's number one. Number 2 is we wanted that money so badly that we were willing to do anything to compromise the values, the principles, the foundation of the United States of America in order to keep access to that market. So we suppressed free speech. We wouldn't talk about human rights. You know, American Chamber of Commerce didn't want us to do anything about Hong Kong. surely if Taiwan is, reunified, it's going to be a huge business lobby push to keep things status and just say, oh, Taiwan was always part of China. Whatever the case is, we were doing stuff that is not good for our form of capitalism, for our country, the republic, the freedom of which we stand, one nation, right? Like, we have not done it right. And it took me a long time. It actually took me until October of 2019 when I watched the bumbling and fumbling of the reaction of the NBA and the criticism around it. Once Daryl Morey sent out that tweet, fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. That woke me up. I was like, oh my God, I was doing the exact same thing that everybody's criticizing the NBA for, and it feels icky and wrong. And it also seems like we really gave the heavy hand and all the leverage to the China side, and we need to fix it. And if you remember in my book, I even talk about how China uses the playbook that we had back in the early 1800s when we were doing sort of the same thing to Europe to catch up with them with our industrial revolution. And one day Europe said, hey, enough is enough. You've stolen our IP. You've done the tech theft. You've had these protectionist policies. You've had your tariffs. Like, enough is enough. And instead of going to war with us again, they said, you built your industry, your industrial revolution and your economy off of our backs. We want to make money off of it now. So let's rebalance the playing field. And that's what we need to do with China moving forward. And I think, I say punch in the nose mainly because Matt Pottinger, who I think you also know too, a national security advisor for Trump, but also a nonpartisan and a patriot and a guy who really knows China extremely well and is extremely intelligent about the way he talks about it. He actually was punched in the nose. And the day he was punched in the nose was the day that he realized China's not in our best interest either. He was a journalist who went to meet with a source at a Starbucks in China to talk about yellow cake trade, which is the, very dirty part of nuclear processing or whatever it is. And some operative with the Chinese Communist Party walked up to him and this source, asked him to stand up, and then punched him in the nose and said, get the hell out of China. And that was the day Matt goes, whoa, this is bigger than a lot of us thought. There's a mission here that's different on their side than ours. And we got to be aware of that. And I think everybody engaged with China, whether they're, US China experts, whether they're politicians, whether they're, corporate leaders, whether they're journalists or critics or anything in between, military, you name it. We all know that the current engagement, the way we are doing it right now with China, is in the worst process of becoming what tears apart the foundation of our country and the Western alliance, right? If there is a Western alliance, but our multilateral allies around the world. And if we continue it, we're going to get to the point of no return. And all of us know it. It's just some of us have refused to change course because there's agendas that are too powerful to make that happen, right? Like, we all know the dubs that I see on CNBC talk about, well, we need to start figuring out how to raise more money out of China and open up the markets. And we can't close off Alibaba, even if they're not accounting, doing the accounting principles, abiding by the regulations by the SEC in order to have proper accounting purposes. We can't lose that type of, trade between the two countries, right? Like, you see,
too big to fail. Can't do it. Yeah.
It's too big to fail, but they're also talking their book. And there's a huge amount of money and a lot of people's lives involved. People trying to put food on the table that are secretaries of these companies to, the CEO. And then on top of it, you want CEOs of companies like, I don't know, Disney to say, oh, well, that was terrible that we put the, thank you card for the Xinjiang province officials at the end of Mulan. But you know what? They're fiduciaries for investors and shareholders and all the people that work there. And if they shut off business with China, they're responsible for what they say that caused the demise of people's pocketbooks, right? Like, so there's a lot of reasons a lot of people haven't done the right thing yet.
Yeah.
But we're getting to that point. Like the WTA, the Women's Tennis Association, which we can talk about, they did it. And they're actually getting rewarded for it. And it's one of the great case studies that's occurring right now. Anyway,
that was a huge thing I did. I actually did a 3-part video series on that. And it was to me, it was a huge win for the good guys. I'm not talking about anyone in specific, like the people that actually stood up and then were rewarded for it with publicity.
So
and
let
that's
me ask this. Can I ask you a question? What was your moment of being punched in the nose?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I think you, Chris, used a great word when you said icky, because it gave me a flashback to when I had my icky moment. And I think you've seen things from a real macro scale, and I was more from a micro scale. I live Chinese speaking American living in China for 10 years, right? And when I had people reach out to me or talk to me, in Chinese, on the street, in a village, friends, I realized that I was this kind of weird anomaly that people could open up to because I wasn't Chinese. For some reason, me being like a good listener and being able to speak their language and stuff meant that I probably wasn't going to go to authorities and tell on them or something. There was like some sort of trust that I formed with strangers and friends alike. And what I noticed is in this grand scheme that both me and my buddy were, trying to promote China, trying to make sure that people looked at China from a fair lens, to see the rural people, the part that the Chinese government doesn't shine a light on, the good people, the salt of the earth people. In that mission, we were completely self-censoring, and we weren't talking about the things that were actually affecting the people that were reaching out to us about. So when we're in a village and people come together and start talking to you about something, about how, for example, a local official had, and I don't want to get too graphic, but raped and murdered a 14-year-old girl in the village, right? They didn't go with this information anywhere because their protests, when they had it, got shut down. People were jailed, lost their jobs, and they never were able to talk about it again. But here they were crying and talking to some random foreigner that they've only talked to for 2 hours because they randomly showed up on motorcycles in their village, and opened up about that. And when you are sitting there listening to these stories, listening to people bare their souls, friends alike coming to you and saying, listen, I got to tell you what happened to my mom, tell you, bare their soul with this whole story. And then you, instead of saying like, wow, like this needs to be discussed, that's a serious issue that needs to be dealt with, your first gut instinct is to say, in America, we have these problems too. Or, in the US, it's absolutely, we absolutely have these kind of issues. So don't feel like this is out of the ordinary. You find yourself running defense for atrocious acts when you should be comforting someone, because you don't want to jeopardize that greater mission that you've kind of set yourself out to do. And that was my wake up call, was when these things compounded over and over again. And I just felt sick because I'm trying to make a livelihood in a country that I can't actually talk about things that are hurting people. And that is when I just made a massive shift. And, everyone out there in my audience knows my story about how I ultimately had to leave China.
I've heard that a bunch.
Yeah, sure. Incredible. But yeah, thank you for asking me that. It's what I just said, I really haven't really talked about in detail. But that was my kind of embarrassing, gross moment where I said, I can't do this anymore.
Was there one, sorry, I don't mean to be the interviewer.
No worries.
Like, was there one conversation that like really tripped it off, or was it a culmination of a bunch and you're just like, wow, I've been turning the other way over all of these years? Like,
it was one conversation that made me think about the culmination of everything. And it was with a good friend of mine that I can't even go into too much detail about, because he ended up going to jail for 15 days just for being in one of my videos, right? One of my dearest, closest friends in China that I had to obviously take off of YouTube. But when he bared his soul and told me something that he could never, ever, ever tell anyone else for fear of being labeled a traitor or trying to make China look bad or something like this, when he told me that was not some stranger in a village, that was like somebody I'd spent 7 years bearing my soul to, right? And that was the moment. I mean, you have like little things that obviously lead you to understand how China actually works. Like, for example, you go out, I got invited on like a photography tour. Someone's like, we're gonna go to this village and we're gonna take pictures of this really amazingly preserved village in the middle of nowhere that no one knows about.
No, I've heard that stuff, the BBC and all that stuff. Like,
actually, it's a different one. I'm trying to throw in some new stuff for everyone out there. But yeah, I went out to this village, and when I got there, it was actually a full-on the propaganda department of the local village that was making people, like literally taking their arms, making them pump water, Go over there and wash some rice. Go over there and have a conversation. Go over there and rake this field or whatever. Waking people up and making them be little peons in this kind of fantasy that they had created, so that people could walk around and, take photos and be like, look at how natural this looks. When I saw just things like that, just the way that the government manipulates scenes and tries to paint this amazing picture just because a foreigner was there. I mean, all those things build up too, but those are the kind of things that you make excuses for. Those are the kind of things that you're like, this is just how China works, right? It's the personal things for me that made me really kind of flip a switch, if that makes sense.
I think, and a lot of that stuff, this sort of portrayal, the narrative, the visual that you want people to see. I mean, one of the problems when you see it so in your face from China is you pick up even here in the United States of America, that same type of manipulation at times,
Sure.
From press releases to news stories or whatever. And it's not in necessarily a nefarious or pernicious kind of, angle or strategy, but it is interesting how, when you see it blatantly in your face of how they're trying to make people think about stuff, it's interesting how even in a free society, you see really good PR spin, you see really good, whether it's corporate strategists or whatever, or brand builders do the same thing. And it's obviously not for a state directive or whatever, it's for making profits or, creating whatever the story is. But you do start to pick it up a lot differently than other people. And I hate it too, because it makes you a much more, what's the word? I guess just more skeptical about stuff, right? But
cynical,
the other thing that you bring up too is that unguarded behavior of Chinese. Like if you think about, once again, my understanding of China is an onion peel less than yours, maybe even more than that. But you think of Guanxi or Shirley or the amount of time and effort you got to put in to cultivate a relationship in China in order to create trust, right? And that's why business people have such a problem with China, because like they think, oh, you just go over there, meet with the right people, shake hands, have dinner, and boom, you got a great deal over a handshake. But that's not really how it works. But if you get people that are in this group think and they have this unbelievable, obstacle to free speech, and you get them in the right type of setting, it's amazing what they'll say to you, and I think it is because we're safer. There's no way we're a CCP operative that's going to throw them in jail for saying something. And I actually take it in my own experience. Like I took 3 congressional members over to China just prior to COVID, Kirkpatrick from Arizona, Titus from Nevada, and Lowenthal for Long Beach. I'm a trustee for the U.S. Asia Institute, and I do a bunch of stuff in D.C. And we had an ambassador for the NPC, the National People's Congress, touring with us. And then he had deputy ambassadors with him. And we sort of sat in the front of the plane and they sat in the back, but like there was somebody that, needed my seat in the front more than I did. So I volunteered my seat and I sat in the back with one of the deputy ambassadors on a flight from, where was it? From Chengdu to Beijing. And, in the coach seats on domestic flights there, you're right next to the person. So we had no choice but to talk. And it was amazing, the stuff that she was saying to me, that you're just like, wow, like I can't believe you're disclosing this about your criticism of this or that or whatever. And she's a Communist Party member, but then she also always would finish it by like, I don't understand why we can't see eye to eye on things that we are different on. Like, why can't we agree to disagree? Like, why are you guys always trying to force us to look at things your way versus ours? And it was very interesting. And that was pre my punch in the nose. So like, I came out of that trip going, okay, they're taking over Hong Kong, because we met with protesters and Carrie Lam, and we were down there. That was crazy. And then we were up in Beijing twice, and we heard the party line on all that stuff. And I was like, okay, this is crazy stuff that's happening here. But in a way, maybe we look the other way because of X, Y, and Z, right? And then, of course, the Daryl Morey tweet came a month later, and then my whole perspective changed. But what you're saying really resonates with me. It's fascinating to hear.
Great. Just a couple more things I wanted to throw your way. Just so we're not like on this dour kind of note, is there any particular like funny, crazy China story that you would like to share?
Well, I mean, God, there's so many of them, but I think, I cover some great ones, obviously, in the book. And I would say, one of the things that I particularly love about China, because I'm like a closet garage band guy, is just their massive, KTV, karaoke television setup over there, right? Like if you're one of the most fun things about doing business in China is that it usually ends the night at a karaoke bar, and these karaoke bars are fantastic. And by the way, there's different levels of them, right? Which the ones that are higher different are the ones I don't like to go to, because there's obviously a prostitution thing or whatever goes on. But there's the lower levels are great too, because they actually fill like little audience seats with people that are cheering for you and like giving you beverages and all that kind of stuff. And you sing all kinds of crazy songs. And I learned a bunch of Mandarin songs. Like my favorite one is Dui Men Nu Hai Kan Go Lai, right? And I got invited to sing that song on television in China. So I actually have I've tweeted it out before. I'll have to send you
sure. Yeah, please.
Clip of it. You can add to this. But it was insane. Like I did it. I mean, it was a live audience of, say, I don't know, 1,000 something people, but who knows how many others saw it. And it was crazy. And I show it to friends today and they're just like, I cannot believe you did that. And, it's just, to me, it was one of those things. And this was before my punch in the nose, but it was sort of like, when in Rome, do as the Romans. And, hey, we're a guest here, let's entertain and engage and all that kind of stuff. And, I'm seen as a American coming over and saying, this is the way we're going to do it. And I'm like, no, I'm coming over here to do it the way you guys want to do it. Because that is the way you access another person's, nation or house or whatever it is. And I just love the karaoke stuff over there. I'm sure you got some good stories from those nights, and drinking lots of baijiu.
Oh yeah, of course. The baijiu, it's a learned love. I think you can unlearn it as well. I feel like if I went back to baijiu, I just wouldn't have the same fun with it.
Well, they got the Muay now. Everybody's, pricing up super high. So anyway, but I'll tell you something for your audience that is a really interesting unkept secret, or kept secret, and you can't get it here. But like one of the things I used to love about going to China is they have, Hongzhou, like the red wine, and they had these great, in fact, I have a bunch in my cellar because I give them as gifts, because you can't get them anywhere else. And somebody that has everything, you got to give it to them. But these wooden crates, and inside the crate are these bottles of Cabernet from the Great Wall Vineyard. Now, I have no idea if there's actually a vineyard. I've never seen a vineyard up by the Great Wall. I've been up there a bunch of different areas, but it's called Great Wall Wine. And it's really actually pretty good. In fact, I'm the one guy like on the Air China flight back to the US where, they're like, oh, you want Hongzhou or whatever. And I was like, oh yeah, I'll take the Great Wall versus the, Bordeaux or whatever.
And they're like, wow.
Yeah. And they're like, what? You want that? And I was like, yes.
That's awesome. Good stuff. So I just wanted to cap this off with asking you, I mean, I feel like, we all go in different directions after our post-China story. I went into human rights advocacy. It's what I do now. I tell the stories of the downtrodden in China, right? What's next for you? And also, what do you see? Like, what do you recommend? What path do we take as Americans in dealing with, the current situation, the current leadership of China?
Well, there's a couple fronts. Like one is I'm continuing to work with people in Washington, D.C. to at least tell them what I see about the relationship and what I think might be interesting courses of action. And I'm just one of those many players that is lending advice there, because one of the things is like, we need to drastically rebalance the relationship, but it has to be constructive.
Yeah.
And it has to put America first. I'm not trying to sound Trumpian,
Sure.
but we got to put America and our allies first.
Right.
And on top of it, we need to know, no matter how hawkish you are, and there's some like Pottinger, for instance, or Kyle Bass, or some of these guys were like, we don't want war. We don't want Cold War. Like, we have to figure out a way to coexist. So that's always the baseline for me. And I do think cultural and commercial exchange is a good way to do it if it's completely rebalanced and it's not forced censorship or propaganda, if it's a righted sort of trade balance where like everybody's abiding by the same rules and principles and all that kind of stuff, essentially going back to what the Europe and US had. So that's the Washington D.C. front. Number two is in the entertainment business, I'm still heavily involved. I'm producing movies, I'm financing stuff, through a fund I raised. And what I love about it is that now, and obviously there's a lot of news about Netflix and their earnings announced yesterday, but the efficiency of monetizing entertainment content from Hollywood has never been better. So we actually don't need China anymore as far as generating revenues and still creating profits. There's a lot of other markets and platforms.
Look at Spider-Man, right?
Yeah, to take its place. So we don't need to kowtow anymore. We got to stop that. And the reason for that is we don't necessarily need China anymore. They don't have the leverage. And until we realize that, I'm still seeing the same kind of engagement. So I'm hoping the more involved I am in the entertainment content space, the more I can start to like get that word out that, hey, we don't need to do this anymore. Like, let's be the bastions for creative expression and the freedoms of that. And let's like protect free speech rights and avoid censorship and all that kind of stuff. So that's number two. And number three is I'm really trying, thanks to you having me on the platform or ESPN citing me in something or me being on various shows, I'm really trying to bring attention to the fact that China affects every American, everyone, and everyone in the West. And we are not doing the engagement now that is healthy for the environment of the United States of America and the republic on which we stand, or for our allies around the world. Like, we need to change the dynamic. Otherwise, the dynamic is going to change us. So I'm trying to Olive Garden that message out there to people that necessarily don't have enough time to even think about China. Because the day we're going to think about China, if no one's trying to seed it prior, is going to be the day when it's really bad, which is like they reunify with Taiwan and Congress is deciding whether to go to war. Like that, right. We don't want to get to. We want to be aware and cognizant of what's happening. In fact, Alex Gibney and Gabe Polsky, two of the great documentarians, have the rights to my book, and they're going to make a big documentary out of it that essentially is taking the foundation of my book, but then talking about every part of the relationship between the U.S. and China. And that's crucial because it touches every industry, it touches every global company, it touches every aspect of the globe right now, because China's rise has happened so quickly and with such strength and vigor.
Well, Chris, I absolutely can say you're a great mind, and I got that through your book. I highly recommend to everyone out there to go check it out. Obviously, there'll be links down in the description. Feeding the Dragon, I ripped through it in 2 days, not because I had to, because it was that captivating. A lot of nostalgia, obviously, there for me as a guy that formerly lived in China, but also for anyone with the modicum of interest in how Hollywood kind of dealt with China. Absolutely go check it out. And I want to say thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate you being on the show.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And anybody that's on Twitter, you can follow me at the Dragon Feeder. I try to really sort of provoke conversation a little bit without being controversial, but trying to be entertaining. And I love to hear other points of view on this. And that's super important. And we didn't even get into some of the books and experts that I love out there. Maybe you'll have me back on and we can get into all the other parts of the conversation we didn't even get to. I think we just touched the outermost peel. So anyway, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on, and thank you to your audience for tuning in.
Don't forget to check out Chris's book. Links are in the description. And don't forget to support me over on patreon.com/Laowinner86. Thanks.